Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to SAR. Welcome back to SAR. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a new series, what we're calling our Winter Lecture Series. And our first winter lecturer, I will introduce in a moment. First, again, let me just thank you for coming, and a couple of announcements. First of all, we will have another lecture in this series by Alma Gottlieb, professor recently moved to Santa Fe, and she will speak in late March. Keep an eye out for that. And before that, we have another lecture. Jason De Leon will be speaking, although that is going to be at Site Santa Fe, February 13th, Thursday evening. Site Santa Fe. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, Adobo Catering, Dan Marians at UBS Financial Services, Patricia Foshi Charitable Fund, Thornburg Investment Management, King Galleries, Red Wealth LLC, Santa Fe Dining, Shiprock, and Walter Burke Catering. Thank you to all of those institutions and people for their support for this event. It is a great pleasure to introduce Frank Korom, Emeritus Professor of Religion and Anthropology at Boston University. Frank has recently relocated to Santa Fe, where he lived and worked in the 1990s. His PhD and MA are from the University of Pennsylvania, and his bachelor's degree from CU Boulder. Frank has a tremendously impressive CV, so I won't be able to cover it in great detail. He is the author of 4 books and a 5th in process. In process is Guru Bawa and the Making of a Transnational Sufi Family. Published already are Village of Painters, Narrative Scrolls from West Bengal, South Asian Folklore, a Handbook, Hosay Trinidad, Muharram Performances in an Indo-Caribbean Diaspora, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Folkloristics and Indian Folklore. He also is the editor of 6 books and too many articles to count. Frank was here. Some of you may have known him from his time as a curator of Asian and Middle Eastern collections at the Museum of International Folk Art in the 1990s. So please join me in welcoming back Frank Korom.
Thank you for the introduction, Paul, and I'd like to thank SAR for the invitation to speak. Last time I spoke here was back in the 90s when I lived in Santa Fe the first time, as Paul mentioned, and at that time I was speaking about cows in India, but so I won't be speaking about cows today, but I do have a horse to share with you in one of my slides, so that will be coming up. So for those of you who read my abstract earlier, I wanted to talk about a project that I carried out mostly in the 1990s and then with some follow-up research in the early 2000s, and then several periodical visits after that. And it was a part of a collaborative project, so I'll get into some of the details of that. So the preliminaries will be, I first want to acknowledge some of the funders, the abstract you already seen there, some of my collaborators, there's a dedication, and then a few terms that we'll need to know for my talk, and then a timeline, and then we'll go into the heart of the talk. So the project was funded by, at various times, the American Philosophical Society. The film that resulted from the project is distributed by DER, Documentary Educational Resources. Smithsonian Center for Folklife Programs was the major funder. And of course, SAR. I was a summer fellow here in 2001, where I wrote the first draft of the book, Hosay Trinidad. And the talk is really about that and what has happened since I published the book. I want to dedicate this talk to my co-principal investigator in the project, Peter Chelkowski, who just recently passed away in Turin, Italy. He was really the inspiration for this project. He edited this landmark book in 1979 called Tazieh, Ritual and Drama in Iran. And so Peter was one of the driving forces behind my interest in this particular topic. And we ended up going separate ways, but the other collaborators in the project were John Terry there on the upper left. He was the sound man for the film, that's me. And then Guha Shankar, currently with the Library of Congress, but at the time with the Smithsonian Office of Folklife Programs. He was the gaffer for the film. And John Bishop was the cameraman for the film. And the results were this film that DER is distributing called Hosay Trinidad, and the book that I published in 2003, also called Hosay Trinidad. And yes, so let me just move on to some terminology then. Several terms that I'll be using in this presentation I've listed for you here just so you can get a feel for some of the vocabulary. Tazieh refers to this, it's also the title of Peter's book. It refers to what some Orientalists during the colonial period called the Persian Passion Play. And it's an Iranian dramatic thing that reenacts the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Hussein being the third Imam in the Shia tradition, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Muharram is a term for the first lunar month of the Islamic calendar, but in South Asia, the term Muharram is used for the rituals that originated in what is now Iraq and Iran. I'll get more into the historical background in just a moment. So Ashura refers to the 10th day of the lunar month of Muharram. That is the culmination of these rituals. It's the day on which Imam Hussein died in a battle that I'll talk about in just a moment. And the rituals are really a reenactment of those historical events. And finally, the term Hosay, after which my film and book is named, is a creolized version of the name Hussein. And in the Caribbean, it is used for what in South Asia would be called simply Muharram, or what in Iran and other parts of the Near Middle East would be called Tazieh. Now, there are some significant differences, which I'll get into, but Hosay is the term, as I mentioned here, the creolized term for Tazieh Muharram, and it's used in a number of places in the Caribbean. So just some dates very quickly. Hussein ibn Ali, he died in 680 at the Battle of Karbala, which took place on Ashura, the 10th of Muharram, in the year 680. And the rituals that evolved as a result of his martyrdom eventually became part of Persian culture during the Safavid dynasty, and also continued through the Qajar period. And then when the Shah came in, he sort of oppressed it all, but it continued to be practiced and was revived after the Iranian Revolution. India is a big part of this story because we're talking really about not only a rite of passage, but also the passage of rites from Iran to the Indian subcontinent and then from there over to the Caribbean. So that was a result of British rule after the abolition of slavery. An indentureship system was set up to bring Indians to fill the labor vacuum that was left by the abolition of slavery. So in Trinidad, the dates vary depending on which part of the British Empire we're discussing, but in Trinidad, the indenture period ran from 1845 to 1917. The Trinidad and Tobago Independence Act was 1962. The Republic of T&T was established in 76. And the first Prime Minister of Indian descent, Basdeo Pandey, ruled from 1995 to 2001. So that's sort of the time frame we're talking about. it's quite a long durée there from 680 of the Common Era down to the present, so we have to move very quickly. And away we go. Okay. So the first part of my talk is called just simply rites of passage. We can think of the rituals associated with Muharram as being a rite of passage in the annual sense, because it's something that is reenacted every year, but it's also a communal rite of passage for people involved. And it's all based, as I mentioned, on this battle that took place in Karbala, which is now in present-day Iraq. And here is a popular tea house painting that's in the Brooklyn Museum. It's a narrative scroll. Of course, I'm interested in these from a different part of the world, but you often find these, or found them, past tense, in tea houses in the Persian-speaking world. And it's basically a montage, so each little frame, they're all melded together as a mosaic, but each one tells a little part of the story about Hussein's martyrdom. So, and I promised you a horse, so you have the horse here in the middle. The rider is not Hussein, the main martyr, but a figure known as Abbas. And Abbas was the standard bearer, the flag carrier for Hussein's party of 72, when all the male members of the party were slaughtered at this Battle of Karbala. And I chose this particular painting specifically because Abbas is in the foreground, and he is one of the figures I want to focus on in the conclusion of my talk when I discuss what has happened since I first published the book in 2003. So here's another example of one of these narrative scrolls as a wall hanging. This one is on cloth. And an anthropologist by the name of Michael Fisher, who wrote a book about Iran and revolution, coined the term Karbala paradigm to talk about the way that this historical incident, this battle, has become embodied by Shi'i Muslims throughout the world. Of course, the Battle of Karbala, for those of you who aren't familiar with the history of Shi'ism, was the sort of defining moment when the Shia broke away, splintered away, and created a distinct form of Islam that was separate from, you could argue, similar to, but separate from the majority Sunni. And so that's something to keep in mind. And Fisher refers to the role that this narrative plays in Shi'i everyday ethics and morality as the Karbala paradigm, a model by which one should live one's life. Shortly after Hussein's martyrdom, rituals started developing, both public and private forms of rituals, and they sort of solidified and got canonized during the Safavid period and into the Qajar period. And here you have an example of an arena, they're called taqiyehs. The taqiyeh Dawlat, the state taqiyeh, was built in Tehran in 1868, I believe, and it lasted until 1946, when it was finally demolished, and now there's a bank in that very same spot where this was. But these arenas were built specifically for what Orientalists came to call the Persian Passion Play, as I mentioned. So you see the raised proscenium stage there, and all of the events of the Battle of Karbala would be enacted there by actors. But there were also stationary forms of practice. This particular theatrical performance is what taziyeh refers to. It comes from the Arabic word for to mourn, right? So the whole purpose of this play was not simply for entertainment, but rather to subjectively apprehend and experience the suffering and the pain and the death of Hussein, right? I call it subjective apprehension in my book. So the whole idea was that by participating and mourning for Hussein, one could achieve soteriological benefits. Namely, on the Day of Judgment, Qiyamah, one would get a pass, a green light to get into heaven, right? So participating in the various activities during the first 10 days of the month of Muharram, culminating on Ashura the 10th, guaranteed one's place in heaven. And Imam Hussein, theologically, was considered to be an intercessor who could argue your case with the higher authorities on that Day of Judgment. So these arenas were built to house, these grand, spectacular performances that were sanctioned by the state. But there were also other forms of observance, such as majlis. Majlis just refers to a gathering. These could be in special places called Husainiyas, where you would have a reciter who you see at the center there. This particular image is a painting from India, that's in the British Museum, from an area called Awadh, where a lot of the people I'm going to talk about in Trinidad originally came. And a majlis was a gathering where the Rose Khan, the person in the middle there, would recite poetry that would induce weeping, okay? So the crowds here in the audience would be listening to this person, and they would just start crying and so on, as a way of subjectively apprehending Hussein's own suffering and death. Now, here's a contemporary majlis also from India, same area where many of the people who came to the Caribbean as indentured laborers originated. So you can see that this is a tradition that continued as the rituals moved from Iraq and Iran, present-day Iraq and Iran, to the Indian subcontinent. And then finally, there is a tradition known as matam. Matam is an expression of grief, and it could take various forms. The simplest form would be a simple beating of the chest, and you can see some people doing that there in the center. See another person buried in the ground here, and a person getting ready to put a bucket on his head in the lower right there. In the back, you have processions of people doing matam. But you also had, I'll spare you all the bloody scenes, but a lot of people would also, and you may have seen this every year during Ashura, CNN or some other news channel tries to sensationalize Ashura by showing the bloodier side of it. So people would often, cut themselves on their forehead with knives or whip themselves with whips, oftentimes with razor blades or shards of glass woven into the braids of the whip. So it took a variety of forms, but matam refers to this whole range of things that were done in processions in public. And this is a 17th century depiction of matam from Persia, which is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And here you have a contemporary shot of people practicing matam in an imambara, which is another enclosure in which the tajas that I'm going to be talking about are often kept. So here, this is again a picture from India. So that should give you a sense of the range of activities associated with the Ashura rituals or the Muharram rituals. But now I'd like to move on to the passage of rites, the way that the rituals moved from the Indian subcontinent over to the Caribbean. As I mentioned, the abolition of slavery left a labor vacuum on a lot of the British sugarcane plantations around the world, be it Fiji, Mauritius, or Jamaica, or Trinidad, or Guyana, or a number of other places. The Dutch had an indenture system in Suriname as well. So the way it worked was people would sign up for a 5-year indentureship, and they would be shipped to one of these island plantocracies, and they would work for 5 years and then be guaranteed passage back. But of course, in most cases, as one historian put it, it was just another system of slavery, but without the chains. So a lot of people still talk today about being tricked, conned into coming over, but then the promises and the contractual agreements were broken. So many of the people ended up staying in the countries where they were indentured. The first ship to sail to Trinidad was the Fatah Razak, which was actually owned by a Muslim merchant in Bombay, but it sailed from Calcutta on the 30th of May in 1845 and arrived roughly 90 days later in Trinidad. And after that, you had regular ships coming, bringing more indentured laborers from India, British India, to various parts of the Caribbean, and especially to Trinidad. Now, the people who came over, not all of them were Muslims. In fact, the majority of them were Hindus, and there were Christians as well. But they were all sort of involved in the process of what is called Hosay in the Caribbean. And this entailed building these large structures which were replicas of the tomb of Imam Hussein, the original one being in Karbala, Iraq, presently. Now, of course, the actual tomb doesn't look anything like these models, but so there's a lot of innovation involved in the way these are made. They were often made tall and spiral-like so that they could be seen from a long distance. But with the introduction of telephone wires, as we'll see later on, they sort of shrank in size and became more square-like in shape rather than tall and cylindrical in nature. And here you see they're being carried on people's shoulders, but as you'll see, now they're put on platforms and wheeled through the streets as part of this procession. So these structures are called taja, and taja, if you recall, is the word, the dialectal word for tazia or tazieh. So unlike in Iran, where tazieh refers to the dramas, the ritual dramas, in India, tazieh or tazia in Urdu refers to these model tombs that are carried in procession in honor of Hussein and his older brother Hassan. And here you see some contemporary tajas from, I think this was around 2012 or 2013. And you can see they're much more colorful. Well, these are black and white, but they're much more colorful than previous ones. A lot of them are made with paper mache, styrofoam, and various other materials that are either brought from abroad or produced in Trinidad. And these are paraded around in the streets along with a variety of other things. Now, I'll get into those things in just a moment. So, yes, this particular space here is called a chowk. And in the film, you can see that each evening from the 1st of Muharram through the 10th of Muharram, people would gather and pray at these particular chowks before they would continue working on building the taja inside of the Imambara. So these chowks were considered, chowk literally means a square or plaza, you could say. And so there are famous places in India like Chandni Chowk in Old Delhi, which incorporates that word. So these are these places in front of the place, the Imambara where the tajas are built, are called chowks, and much of the ritual prayer during the 10 days is performed at these sites. In addition, and here is a taja from Balma Yard. There are 4 yards, now 5, where tajas are built in St. James in Trinidad, which I'll get to in just a moment. But this was the one that was built in 1992 in Balma Yard. And it's from the cover of a magazine in which the late Peter Chalkowski and I published an essay. And this was the one that was being built when we filmed down there. So we'll come back to that perhaps later. In addition to building these ritual objects that are used in the processions, there's also a lot of drumming. And I'm not going to do any sound bites for you today, but the main drum that the cutter plays is a tassa drum, and you can see two varieties. The one on the left here is one from Trinidad. The one on the right is from Jamaica. And they're accompanied by bass drums, which you see in the middle there. And one of the interesting things about the drumming tradition, especially in Trinidad, is tassa drumming goes all the way back to the Middle East. So you have tassa drums being played during the processions in Iran as well, back in the Middle Ages. But they take on a very distinct quality rhythmically in the subcontinent, and those rhythms were brought to Trinidad. And essentially, they tell the story of the Karbala paradigm, right? And so I talk about them as being speech surrogates in my book. So what happened was essentially these indentured laborers, when they came to the Caribbean, lost or failed to retain their mother tongue, and they gradually, after generations, spoke Creole English, and they forgot how to speak Bhojpuri, the dialect of Hindi that they would have spoken back home. So the drums sort of replaced the verbal narrative, and the drums literally tell sonically the story that is the master narrative behind the Karbala paradigm. So here you see a variety of pictures of people playing the bass drum there. On the other side there, you see a few tajas in the background with the tassa ensemble, and then more bass drums down here. And then the third instrument that is used for accompaniment is the giant you see in the lower right there. On the left-hand side, somebody playing these cymbal-like instruments. Those are also used in accompaniment with the tassa. The tassa is the lead drum, and the bass and the giants keep the rhythm. So you have the construction of the tajas, the visual dimension, then you have the oral dimension of these drums that accompany the parading of the objects. The other material thing that is constructed annually, and I want to focus in my conclusion on these, they're called moons in Trinidad. They actually come from India. The term that's used there is sipar, and it refers to the shield of Hussein. But these become bodily representations of Hussein and his brother Hassan. So the red moon over there is the one that represents Hussein, since Hussein was killed in battle. One account says that he was riddled with arrows like a porcupine, and then he was finally beheaded, and his head was taken to Damascus for the caliph there to prove that he was slain. So the red symbolizes the blood. This one they call the green moon, but it looks more blue on the other side. It's more bluish in nature, but it does have some green in it. And green refers to Hussein's older brother Hassan, who died 10 years prior to the Battle of Karbala, most likely from consumption due to poisoning. So green represents the poison that killed Hassan. So the tradition in the subcontinent is that Hassan and Hussein are mourned together as two brothers, right? So you see these moons they refer to it as dancing. You dance the moons. And this is a new moon no pun intended, which is white in nature. And we'll get to that one in just a moment. But you see the red and the green moon getting together on the 10th, which is called Big Hosay night, when they bring out the Tajas in procession, and they kiss. And the way it was explained to me when I was doing field work was that this is the brothers saying goodbye to one another. So they sort of constructed their own oral history, you could say, to explain the rationale behind the creation and construction of these moons and parading them and dancing them in the streets. But of course, historically, that's inaccurate because, as I said, Hassan actually died a decade prior to the Battle of Karbala, so he wasn't there. Abbas, however, the figure that you saw on the white horse in the beginning, did die in Karbala, and he is Hussein's half-brother. Now, when I was doing my field work, our field work, it was collaborative in nature, when we were doing field work and filming, everybody would talk about Hassan and Hussein. Nobody ever mentioned Abbas, right? But Abbas comes into prominence for reasons that I'll discuss in my conclusion. And so now there has been two new moons added, which I'll come back to later, and that's one of the new moons. So I'll just hold off on that for a moment. So in Trinidad, the preparations for this event can take up to 40 days, and then there are 3 nights of actual processions on the street. The first night is called Flag Night. So you can see there is this cartillas are called, where all these flags are placed. And each of those flags stands for a particular vow that someone takes in one of the yards where the tajas are built. And so Flag Night was always explained to me as a time for making promises. They don't use the word vow, they call them promises there, but in South Asia they would be called manasik, vows that would be taken. So, you know, if you heal my son of his illness, I promise to place a flag on this katya for 7 years, something of that sort. Okay, so it's kind of a contractual relationship because it was believed that Hussein also had miraculous powers of healing powers as well as intercessory powers. And of course, the processions go up and down Western Main Road in St. James, which is a suburb of Port of Spain, the capital, and used to be a plantation. So Western Main Road was kind of like the main drag, you could say, back in the plantocracy days. And so it follows the same route. The processions follow the same route that they would have back in colonial times. So here you see the bass and the tasa drums being played as these flags are being paraded on the first night. The second night is called Small Hosay Night, and I don't have any slides of that, but let's jump to Big Hosay Night. Small Hosay Night, as it was explained to me in the 1990s, was for Hassan, who's the big brother. So there's kind of inversion. He gets the smaller Taja. It's also called Hosay, they're synonymous. So it's called Hosay Night, or it could be called Taja Night, but they call it Hosay Night. The older brother, the big brother, gets the smaller Taja. But the emphasis is really on Imam Hussein. So on the final night, called Big Hosay Night, all of the large tajas or Hosays come out. The bands in their full, each yard that builds a taja has their own drumming ensemble, and then the moons come out as well. And that's when you see the kissing going on here. The moons kiss the tajas as well as each other as part of the culmination of the ritual. And then on Ashura Day, which is the day after Big Hosay Night, there is a final ritual done where janazah or funeral prayers are said at a place called Queen's Royal College, QRC. And here you see the moons being placed there. And you have the moon men, the red moon men on the bottom and the green moon men up on top, although they're wearing blue, from the 2001 Hosay. And they're saying their final prayers before the ritual ends on Tija Day. And this is when, during the plantation period, the Tajas or Hosays were taken down to the water. This is from the village of Cidras in southern Trinidad, where the second major performative tradition is located. And they actually take the entire structure out into the ocean and immerse it in the water. And then whatever, it's basically because they're ephemeral, they melt away. And in the morning, the kids would go out onto the beach and gather up the remaining pieces, and those would then be buried. Not very ecologically friendly. There's a lot of plastic and so on involved, but nonetheless, that's part of the tradition because, and this is a Hindu accretion. For those of you who are more familiar with Hinduism, you know, the custom of Visarjan is when you take a deity's icon and immerse it in water at the end of one of these public festivals. So one of the arguments that occur here, and now I'll go into the final portion of my presentation. One of the arguments that is often made against Hosay, and this is why it's contested, the book is really a lot about these contestations and debates, is whether this is Islamic or not. A lot of people argue that, you know, the Sunni especially, the majority of the Muslim community, argue that, you know, this is really just anti-Islamic, that they're making a mockery of Islam, that these objects are being revered or worshiped, which goes against, you know, the unity or the oneness of God, so on and so forth. And these kinds of debates were front and center when we were doing the filming and the research for this project. And they continued. So I want to talk a little bit about what has happened since I published the book in 2003. You know, like many people, I thought, okay, this project is finished. I'll move on to something else. And in the epilogue of my book, I went back to my field notes and wrote the following. I remain optimistic that the resilience of local actors is vital enough to allow for innovation and change in response to the new global challenges that confront the small Hosay community, just as it has in the past. This is not to deny, however, that religious, cultural, ethnic, and racial groups will continue to lobby for their own specific agendas as the ongoing interrogation about the politics of representation and who owns Hosay continue into the uncharted waters of future generations. So that's kind of where I ended the book. And what I was thinking about as I wrote those sentences was precisely the kinds of debates and contestations that occurred as a result of what I call in the book creolization. So creolization refers to you know, languages mixing. Linguists use it to talk about how new languages emerge as a result of linguistic encounters. But cultural creolization works more or less in the same fashion, where you have different cultures encountering one another, and then elements from those various cultures then get mixed together to create something new. So I developed this Creole metaphor in the book as a way to talk about Hosay, because as you saw in some of the pictures, not only East Indians are involved in this. You have Afro-Trinidadians that are involved during the plantation period. There were Chinese people that were involved. So you had a lot of different ethnic groups, but also religious groups. Hindus participated, Christians participated, people who practiced indigenous beliefs and rituals, they were involved and so forth. So the people, and that's why the Sunni Muslims would say that this was not Islamic, it was un-Islamic, and that it was an Indian carnival, right? So carnivalization is something that people would say happened to Hosay, and it really didn't have anything to do with Islam. But on the other hand, the people who were involved in building the Hosays, the Tajas, insisted that this was part of a tradition that is unchanged, static, frozen in the past, and they're practicing it in the present as it was in the past. The other thing, however, that I talk about in the epilogue of my book is about a group of missionaries that came down to Trinidad around the same time that I was wrapping up my ethnographic research in 1994. One of them, a fellow by the name of Korom Ali, this is a group called the Bilal Muslim Mission. And after hearing that there were Shia in the Caribbean, especially in Trinidad and Guyana, they sent a delegation down. The Bilal Muslim Mission has an office in New York and one in Toronto. So Mr. Korom Ali came down from New York in 1993, and he wrote the following about his first trip down there. Soon after the Bilal Muslim Mission of America was formed, I was told that there were some Shiite converts living in Trinidad and Guyana. Most interestingly, we stumbled upon the Hosay festival. Here he's calling it a festival. So again, festival suggests this kind of carnival-like atmosphere rather than a sort of somber, I prefer to use the term observation rather than something. The term fete is also used, but I try to avoid that language in the book out of respect for the people who do this. But he wrote, we discovered the Hosay Festival in Trinidad, which has been taking place every Muharram for the last 150 years to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. This event is organized by the Shiite Muslims of Indian ethnic origin, whose forefathers were taken to Trinidad by the British Raj as indentured laborers. But then he ends his little missal by saying, unfortunately, this Hosay was ignored by everyone. Time eventually took its toll, and the event changed into something that was solemn, into something that was festive in nature. So here the missionary is making the same argument that the Sunni are making and that journalists are making as well, that this is all something ludic in nature rather than something somber and spiritual and religious in nature. One of the things that he pointed out to suggest that it was inauthentic was the fact that they had the history wrong, right? By arguing that Hassan was there with Hussein in battle and all of that. And so one of the things that the missionaries tried to do, they started going down annually after 1993. They started to try and remove all the creolized elements from this particular annual occasion, right? To some degree, they were successful. And he then later wrote in another essay, let me just find it for you quickly. He said, as a result of our activities, only one article against the Hosay procession was printed in local papers compared to dozens of articles in previous years. I won't read the whole thing, but he's basically making the argument that the missionaries that came down there saved the day by removing all of these creolized elements in an attempt to purify the rituals, right? So my conclusion essentially would be that, well, let me just read a little bit and then we'll have to stop and go into the Q&A. But my conclusion would be the following. What all of this suggests to me is that the debates over what Hosay is and what it stands for continues to be contested and hotly debated, since the popular press still tends to sensationalize the event by spreading misinformation about it, as some of the examples I showed you suggest. Yet the missionary presence has certainly had an enormous impact on the reform development of the rite over the past 3 decades since the Bilal mission arrived. Their presence, however, is not something favored by all. especially since there is still some lingering and mostly misconstrued suspicion of radical Islamic activity due to a coup attempt that occurred in 1990, and then the 9/11 incidents in New York in 2001. And so this discourse about whether or not this is Islamic continues down to the present day. Now, as the historian of science Bruno Latour reminds us in his book, We Were Never Modern, purification is unstable and never fully succeeds, since no matter how hard one tries to purify a phenomenon or process, hybridity, or what I have been calling creolization, still creeps in. Therefore, while the missionaries continue their efforts to remove all the elements they view as festive, the more resistance they will encounter, as some of the examples that I didn't show you would demonstrate. For example, humor is often used as a way of going against missionary dogma. I remember during my last ethnographic stint down there, I went back in, when was it, 1996 for a follow-up to write the epilogue. And I remember I was in one of the yards, and this Mr. Kedamali came, and he was wearing a long gown, and he was telling all the other members in the yards who were building the tajas and beating the drums that they should try wearing them. And one of the people involved in the drumming said, "You can't play the drum if you're wearing a dress." Okay, so, but in fact, there are women who now participate, and that's one of the innovations. So these forms of resistance continue, right, in jocular form in other ways as well. So I would say that the contestation continues, but innovation is creeping in as a result of the reforms that the missionaries introduced. So as I mentioned, the moons have evolved, and now we have an Abbas moon. Jamil Bisnat sent me these photos. He is one of the builders of the fifth Taja that was added toward the end of my field work in the mid-90s. And it's for Abbas, the standard carrier of Hussein. And in fact, in Iran, what in Trinidad is called Flag Night is the night when Abbas's observance is performed, when a tazia or play, a dramatic play about his death is performed. According to traditional historians, he was going down to the Euphrates River, where Karbala is situated, to collect water to bring back to Hussein and his family because they were dying of thirst. They were cut off by the Caliph Yazid's army, and before the battle they were holed up there and without any water. So Abbas died trying to bring water to the party for consumption. So his death is mourned on what in Trinidad is called Flag Night. So they've introduced the Abbas moon as a way of honoring him. And a fourth moon is now also added as of as of 2023 and 24 for Ali. And Ali is the father of both Hassan and Hussein, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. So these innovations that have been creeping in continue, right? And although some people would refer to these as further creolizations, as Latour says, such innovations and mixing and creolizations, or what he calls hybridity, is inevitable. It's part of the sort of organic natural process that leads to the perpetuation of the tradition. Although these innovations then lead to more and more debate and contestation and argumentation between the majority Sunni and the minority Shia that are the custodians of this Hosay tradition in Trinidad. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you all for your attention. And I guess we can open it up for a little Q&A, right, Paul? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have people participating online as well, so if we have questions from online, if one comes in, Miriam, please wave me down. I'm delighted to be able to ask some questions or take questions if we have some. If I could start with one, since I have the mic. One of the things that struck me on those last couple of images, Frank, was how much they look like Mardi Gras kind of color scheme. And I've been thinking throughout, there's always a present in the past. And the context in which these rituals are performed in Trinidad, contemporary Trinidad, is in the context in which Trinidadian Carnival is a big deal. Yeah. I'm not sure to what extent you've got other evidence to address that kind of question, the context.
Right, so, Afro-Trinidadians often refer to it as the Indian Carnival. And so this is part of that whole debate about whether this is Islamic or not, and one of the reasons why they call it a festival or a fete rather than an observance, right? So it's often seen, in the book I talk about rings of signification. There's sort of the ethnic dimension that this is an Indian thing and we're all just celebrating our Indianness. But the Shia themselves, who are the custodians of this ritual tradition, in the past they practiced something called taqiyya, which refers to dissimulation. So you can hide your religious identity, just like crypto Jews, for example, which I know the upcoming lecture is going to be about. You can hide your true religious identity if your life is being threatened in some sort of way. And that's how you preserve the tradition, right? So when I first went down there the first year in 1991, nobody would admit that they were even Shia, because they say, oh, we don't make those kinds of distinctions here. They don't have their own mosque, they don't have their own place of, their own cultural center or anything like that. They just talked about themselves as being generic Muslims. But like I say, there were already Hindus and so on involved, and Christians as well. And all of these mixed traditions were already, I couldn't go into detail since my time was limited, but all those traditions were all, what I'm calling creolizations, were already there in India. And even back in Iran, for example, there are comic elements, there's always a clown in taziyas and so forth. So the carnivalistic dimension of it is part of the tradition as well. And I don't see them as diametrically opposed. So you can have the sacred in the secular and the secular in the sacred. They're sort of intermeshed with one another. But yeah, a lot of people who don't know the sort of theological underpinnings of the tradition do think of it as an ethnic carnival, an Indian fete or carnival. Also in the back.
I had two disparate questions.
Yes.
The first is back to India. With Modi's supranationalism now and Hindi, is there a repression of these festivals going on in India, if you know? And then the second question is totally different. Do you see echoes of these issues of representation in the crew that they do in New Orleans with the Native Americans?
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm really competent enough to talk about Mardi Gras in New Orleans, except sort of anecdotally. But to answer your first question, Muharram has always been a time where violence has broken out, and it still does every year. If you just do internet searches around the Ashura, you'll always see reports from India, Pakistan, and elsewhere in the world of Shia and Sunni, confronting one another. And also in India, Hindus and Muslims sometimes don't agree on things, and so there are conflicts there. And in Trinidad too. So, in the 19th century, there was something called the Hosay Massacre, the Muharram Massacre, where the British opened fire on one of these processions, and I think something like 22 people died and hundreds more were injured. So one of the themes of my book is that the rituals are not just about the soteriological effect that it has for people in the afterlife, but it's about the existential present as well. So it was always a form of resistance against tyranny and hegemony, right? Going all the way back to Hussein's martyrdom, right? He argued that the caliph of the time was corrupt, and so he had to die in order to purify Islam, right? So, and of course, a lot of the early Orientalists naturally saw the parallels with Catholicism and the penitentes and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's why they called it the Passion Play. So it does have a kind of a resonating effect with the way that Easter is often thought of in the Christian tradition, right? It's both a time to celebrate, but also a time for mourning. Good Friday, you're sad, and on Easter Sunday, you're happy, right? So same thing with Hosay. But, I don't really want to address your second question because I don't feel I'm really competent to do that. But I would say that in Trinidad, it's open to everyone as long as they follow the rules, right? So there are certain sacrifices you have to make to participate in building the tajas or playing the drums. One is you have to fast for the duration. Another is you have to remain celibate during that period. Gender segregation, women technically aren't supposed to be inside of the imambara where the sacred objects are being built because they menstruate, so it would pollute the area. So as long as you follow all the rules, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is or what your religious background is, you're still welcome. So I helped build one in the Bishali one. In 1996 when I was there. So it's inclusive in that sense rather than exclusive. But that's, again, one of the reasons why the more Orthodox Sunni tend to say that this is un-Islamic, right? You have all these other people doing all this stuff. And then after it's done, of course, they have something called between the janazah prayers and the immersion on Tija Day, they have something called the lime. And liming is, as one ethnographer put it, the art of doing nothing. It's just getting together and talking and playing a little cricket and having a curry cue, a barbecue to make curry. And you're just having fun and you're re-entering the profane world after this period of liminality where you're, abstaining from various things and sacrificing to build these objects and parading them. So it's kind of like a catharsis, right? A collective catharsis that people go through. And then again, that's considered, well, that's un-Islamic, right? So the debate goes on. But we can talk about that Mardi Gras thing afterwards if you like.
Thank you,
I just
Frank.
don't want it on the record.
Very interesting. I was at one of these Hosay events back in the 80s, so you've given it a lot more meaning to me. A couple of questions. One, who has the authority to organize these events? And what individuals or institutions have the authority to insert, let's say, the Abbas and the Ali moons as innovative and creative additions?
Right.
Question two is, all along, as you well know, the northern rim of South America, from Colombia over to northeast Brazil, you have a great deal of Arawak indigenous beliefs. Are there any elements of the Arawak in these events?
To answer the second question very quickly, not that I'm aware of, although they could be there, but there aren't any Arawak really left in Trinidad. They're pretty much exterminated. There are indigenous elements in it, but they're coming through other channels, not directly from that particular source. Now, about authority, and there's something called the Hosay Organizing Committee, and there's a governing body that runs that. And they're responsible for getting the parade permits and all the other things that you have to do. In fact, in the book I talk about how there is a group of Afro-Trinidadians that converted to Shiism. They became Muslims during the Black Power movement, and then they became Shia during the Iranian Revolution, right? And no one even knew they were there, basically, because they were practicing dissimulation, taqiyya. And when we were filming, to my surprise, this group came out, and they were practicing matam, which they don't do in Trinidad, right? And we were all blown away by this because nobody even knew they were there. So this was an Afro-Trinidadian group, and this is Korom Ali, the missionary, really bonded with those people, and they built a cultural center together. But they were separate from the Indo-Trinidadian community, Shia community that builds these tajas, right? And in fact, the reason I even brought that up was because they didn't have a boss or a chief or a headman to organize the procession for them. So they were fined because they didn't have a parade permit. So you have to follow the rules, basically, right, in order to do this legitimately. That's what the Hosay Organizing Committee is for, getting the permits, fundraising, right? So you couldn't see it in the photos, but a lot of times they wear jerseys, T-shirts, that have the sponsor's name written on the back, right? Like a bank or, Bunty's Bar and Grill or whatever it is. These people will give money to the different yards, and in exchange, they get free advertising on the T-shirts that the participants wear. And the government is also now subsidizing the construction of them. They get a certain amount of $20. Each yard gets a certain amount of dollars from the government as part of this, because they're trying to make it into an the government is trying to, the Trinidad Tourist Authority is trying to make it into a tourist attraction, right? To draw in more people and more revenue. So, in fact, they commissioned arches with onion domes on them that one of the Taja builders constructed to mark St. James as being, used to be called Coolie Town during the plantation period. Now it's called Hosay Town because everybody flocks there, to witness this annually. So, the way, and then about the innovations. Innovations generally are considered bid'ah, right? Something bad, something negative. But it's usually something that is decided in the yards themselves. So Jamil Bisnat, whose picture I showed you there of the Abbas moon and of the Ali moon, he's the one who took the initiative to introduce these. So what I write about, I have a paper coming out on this. What I argue there is that this is sort of an invention of tradition, a la Hobsbawm and Ranger, right? The idea that, you can create something new and add an aura of antiquity to it by creating a genealogy that connects it to something in the past. And so I think that Jamil, when I spoke with him about this, he basically said, well, they used to have an Abbas moon way back a long time ago, but it was never danced in St. James, only in other places on the island. So that's how he rationalizes. For him, it's not an invention, it's a sort of a revivification, a revival of a tradition that used to be there that got forgotten and reinstituted. So that's how he argues that he's not breaking with tradition, he's just reviving tradition. And that's how I think a lot of these, what I've been calling creolizations, entered into the tradition in the first place, right? And they were constantly debated, negotiated, and contested. So in the book I refer to the opposite of creolization, which is decreolization, where conscious choices are made about what to accept and what not to accept, right? And so terminology, for example, in Carnival, the places where they make the costumes and so on are called camps. So a camp is like a yard. So they'll say that, camp's like a yard. So there are analogies made, but they'll say it's similar but not the same as, right? So not everything is up for grabs here. There are conscious choices that are being made about what can be accepted and what cannot be accepted.
Yeah, thanks. Really wonderful. I have a couple of sort of quick questions. One is the use of the word Hosay, which is obviously from Hussein, but is that the exclusive word? Do they use the word Muharram? Because I haven't heard the word Hosay used in India, but is that?
No, I think I said that. Maybe I wasn't clear, so I apologize. Hosay is what it's called in the Caribbean, and it would be called Muharram in India and Tazia in Iran. But they're all, I call it the Tazia Muharram Hosay complex.
But it's not used in Bhojpuri, Hosay.
No, in India, it's just usually called Muharram.
Yeah.
And Tazia refers to the actual structures, not the passion play, right? So, but in Trinidad, Hosay is just because they chant Ya Hussein, right? Mm-hmm. And that just Hussein became creolized as Hosay. And when the moons are first brought out, they're circumambulated in the yards around the chowk where they're built. And that's when they say, Ya Hussein, Ya Hassan, Ya Hussein. And now they say, Husay, I say Hosay, right? So the mantra changes a little bit and gets creolized in the process, but it's still in the same spirit. So Hosay is not used in India. It's just referred to as Muharram, and Tazia just refers to the object that's brought out.
My other really brief question is, because of the kind of eclectic, or you could call it creolized nature of all of this, has there been any absorption from the other big movement in Trinidad, namely the Rastafarians?
There's not really much Rasta influence on it, I would say, but they're there. Sometimes, what happens is after the rituals are done, since Rastafarianism is usually associated with Bob Marley and Bob Marley is associated with reggae, it comes back to the musical issue. So sometimes what happens is after the janazah prayers, they stop playing the Hosay hands. The different rhythms are called hands. So then they start playing what's called a soca hand. And the soca hand is more sort of celebratory and uplifting in nature rather than, they have one called the dead hand, which is sort of slowed down funerary type beating or drumming. And then the soca is for, now it's over, we can start liming and have some fun. So they use the more upbeat soca rhythms that are used for carnival. And then, you could say, you can make a connection there with, Jamaican music, but it's not so much present in the material dimension of it. And to get back to I don't think I ever asked you a question. You asked about Modi and there are long-standing conflicts there between Hindus and Muslims that sometimes boil over during Muharram. But I would say by and large that the conflicts are within Islam, right? So between the majority Sunni and the minority Shia, yeah.
Let's give another round of thanks to Frank for this. Oh, is there another? I'm sorry, I missed it. I'm so sorry. One more question.
Thank you. I was curious about the whole format of it because we saw the drumming, but this whole kind of passion play thing are characters selected, or how do you become one of those?
So I tried to cover a millennium and a half in 45 minutes. So unfortunately, a lot was left out, so you'll have to read my book. But anyway, there's a copy of it here in the library. So in Iran, sometimes it's done heritage-wise. So father would pass it on, a particular character to his son. nobody wants to play Yazid, right? Who's the villain. It's been legend has it that, people often die because they play Yazid, right? Because nobody wants to be Yazid, the bad guy. But then also, my late colleague, Peter Chalkowski, in the Tazier plays, there's always a guy wearing like a pith helmet, who's like an ambassador from the Vatican or something like that. So Peter, he was Polish, but he also knew Italian. He would often play the foreign ambassador in some of these Tazier plays because he did his doctorate at the University of Tehran. So that's how he got interested in Tazier in the first place. And then for the next 50 years, from 1968 onward, he taught at NYU and actually had one of these staged at the Lincoln Center. It was sold out for 3 nights. And, there's always this one foreign character. So even one could argue, in the Taziya, there is this element of innovation where new characters are coming in and new elements are being introduced and so on. But the passion play, the drama, the Taziye, it's not something that's emphasized in either the Indian subcontinent or in Trinidad. What is there is what I've called the Karbala paradigm, the master narrative, the historical story upon which the rituals are based. So the rituals are a reenactment of the master narrative, right? So in Iran, they do it as a drama, but they also do it, through performing the matam, the chest beating on the streets and all of that. But the dramatic portion of it is downplayed in India. And what you get instead are an emphasis on the majlis, these groups, these assemblies for mourning, where people would listen to the poet reciting the narratives, and then they would weep and cry, and the street processions where they bring out the tajas. And those tajas, like I said, are considered to have miraculous power, healing power. So touching them would get you the barakat, the grace of God to heal a disease or barrenness in a woman or something of that sort. And that part carries over into Trinidad as well. But like I said, in Trinidad, they didn't retain their mother tongue, so the drums become speech surrogates, and the story is told through the different hands or rhythms that are played that recount. So there's a peace hand, that's when Hussein was marching to Kufa to meet up with his entourage there. There's the war hand when they're in the Battle of Karbala. Then there's the dead hand, for the funerary prayers and so on. And everybody knows the different rhythms. So you can, even if you're not out on the street while the performance is going on, you still know, okay, this is where we are in the narrative now, right? If you're familiar with the tradition. Sure.
All right, thank you so much, Frank. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.